Welcome to The Formed Life. I'm Virginia Kujabi, your host, and this is a podcast for followers of Jesus who long to be shaped by his love and be formed more into his likeness. We will explore spiritual rhythms and have honest conversations and stories that root us in the Trinity, renew our hearts, and transform how we live in relationship with God and others. So grab your coffee, tea, or even LaCroix. I know we have some Diet Coke drinkers in this community. No judgment. Lean in and let's dive into this spiritual conversation. Welcome to The Formed Life. I'm Virginia Wear Kujabi, your host, and friends, we are in for a treat today. We have an amazing author with us that we're going to have a great conversation. Before we jump into all of that, I do want to just share out something a little bit personal. So for those who are watching on YouTube, you're going to see I have a little gold necklace on. It's actually under my shirt. It doesn't go with everything, but I'm actually wearing that. It was a gift from a dear friend of mine named Jennifer Abeg Grant. And Jennifer had an amazing relationship with Jesus, and she would be very excited about this project, the Form Life podcast. Jennifer went to be with the Lord almost 4 years ago after a battle with cancer. She was the beloved daughter of John and Betsy Abeg, wife of Pastor Kevin Grant, and she left behind 5 amazing kiddos. And she's in heaven, but her legacy lives on. And so for that reason, Jennifer was just a dear friend of mine. We were roommates for a season when we lived in Orlando, Florida. We were both missionaries together. And I've been wearing this necklace as I worked on the podcast, almost like I know she's in heaven, probably smiling with the Lord about this project. I think this would be near and dear to her heart. So this episode is dedicated in loving memory of my dear friend, Jennifer Abeg, who had an amazing relationship with God. So with that, I want to introduce us to our guest today, Tanya Godsey, and she is actually the author of this book that I've been reading called Befriending God. But let me give a true introduction, because I have my personal introduction, but you actually have some accolades, Tanya, that I want to make sure that we hit. She's a worship leader and a speaker, a spiritual director, and the founder of Redeeming the Story, a nonprofit organization focused on spiritual renewal and personal development resources and gatherings. She's an artist and the voice behind 4 critically acclaimed albums that invite others into God's transforming presence, and she serves as the host of the Unforced Gifts podcast. She and her husband have been married for over 20 years, and they live in Nashville, Tennessee with their 2 children. Welcome, Tanya.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. So we're going to be diving right in. I'll just briefly share how we connected. Someone that we mutually know on Instagram, when your book launched, she just posted about it, and it sounded very interesting to me. I actually got the audio version first. I devoured it in 3 days. I'm like, I better order the hard copy. And again, for those who are watching on YouTube, for those who are not watching on YouTube, you can't see this, but those on YouTube can see I've got like all the tabs and all the highlights and all the notes in here.
Wow.
It was actually so impactful that I included it with some curriculum. I'm leading a spiritual formation cohort this summer. And this book so well encapsulates so many of the principles that I want us to go through that I actually added it to our summer reading. So I say all that to say I'm thrilled to have you, because I have really been blessed by this book, and I'm just so thrilled that we get to have a deeper dive conversation into your book. So this podcast is actually for followers of Jesus who want to connect more deeply with God, who are potentially on the narrow road. So I wanted to kind of kick us off by just asking, would you share a little bit about your journey of faith? Was there a time where you got introduced to spiritual formation, and what about the narrow road? Would you say there was a season that you got invited to the narrow road? Tell us a little bit about your journey.
Well, I think some people choose the narrow road, and others of us have it chosen for us by the very nature of the things that we are born into and born with or without. And I like to think about the narrow road like this. It's not necessarily a station in life; it's a choice. We can all opt in to the narrow way of Jesus. But regardless of where you were born in the world and what you were born with or without, eventually you will face suffering. You
Mhm.
will begin to feel the tension of life in a homesick world, and you'll begin to ask the question of, are things really supposed to be this way? Like, there's something inside of me that believes that we were made for more, we were made from more and for more. And so, what does that look like? How do we begin to experience that? And so, for me, I was born into an immigrant church. I was born into a Mexican American mission along with my parents and family who were pastors of that church. I am a third generation ministry. So my grandfather was a pastor and
Wow.
his wife was a missionary with him. And then my dad opted in. And then here I am, sort of being faithful in what the Lord has called me to. But by the very nature of the things that we grew up seeing, I really began to understand what it looked like for Jesus to actually be more than a concept, more than a principle, more than a Sunday morning service. Let's check this off the box. Like for me in my community, the narrow way of Jesus looked like feeding people on a weekly basis, making sure that they had clothing, making sure that they could pay their bills. Lots of generosity and benevolence in
Yeah.
our community as a means to survival. So I did not really have the option to look at Jesus as kind of a denominational affiliation or a religious practice. For us, it was daily living. It was the foundation of community interdependence. And I saw the face of Jesus every week in my community. So spiritual formation for us looked like culture. It looked
Mm.
like communion with God and communion with one another. And so it's very interesting that the Lord introduced me to people like Frederick Buechner and and some of like, C.S. Lewis and Henry Now and only God could have gotten someone like myself who lived in the margins
Mm.
onto a path of really like contemplative spirituality. I can't say that anyone else was responsible for that. I mean, if there was anyone else, it would have been Rich Mullins, because I grew up as a singer songwriter and a worship leader, and I was taking notes from him from an
Mm.
artistic sense, and I was going, how does this guy mine spirituality with God in a way that feels wholehearted, that doesn't feel like a derivative of what everyone else is saying? This actually feels like a real time expression of his life with God, and it's real, it's sincere, it's genuine. How do I get that? And then I also found out that he like was basically a, you know, he made a living by handing over all of his money to a committee, and they would pay him whatever the average man in America, the median average, made that year. So I was taking notes from him, and then I was looking around at my community, and it was all about humility, and it was all about interdependence, and it was all about sincere relationship and trust. And so those were sort of the building blocks. And as I went to the word to kind of look at how Jesus lived, I saw people living like that around me. And so there was this beautiful parallel, you know, vertical and horizontal plane that I could very easily access by the way that I grew up. I don't know if that answers your
I
question, but
love it. It more than answered it. And I love that you got Rich Mullins in there. He
yeah.
was instrumental in my faith as a young person. And later, like much past his homegoing, I explored some of his story and just felt even that connection of like being spurred on to some of his practices and some of his what seemed like radical faith, but to him were just like biblical ways to relate with God, which is incredible. I love that you brought him in. You mentioned just now, you talked at the beginning, you mentioned this concept of being homesick, or I think you used the word homesick. And in the introduction of your book, you talk about being like homesick in this world. Will you unpack a little bit for someone who doesn't know, like, what do you mean by homesick? And Yeah, and God being our home. What do you mean by that?
I think we live in a very visual world, very
Yeah.
visual. We're inundated every day with what our eyes can see, what our senses can take in. So much so that we forget that we are a soul. Like we have a soul,
Yeah.
and we have a soul that is set on an eternal trajectory, okay? And so we forget that there is this place inside of us that was made for more, meant for more, and we frequently experience that in the form of a longing. I
Yeah.
would kind of submit to everyone that what really causes pain on this side of heaven, on this side of post Eden life, is longing. Our
Mm,
longing for something that we cannot access. And so for me, homesickness is most easily defined as longing. There's something missing. And I think we feel that most when our friend gets a diagnosis,
yeah.
or when our husband loses his job,
Mm,
or our child begins to struggle at school with friends, and the fill in the blanks of life leave us asking questions that on some level can only be answered by a spiritual communion with God. We realize that on some level that even if I fill in the blanks here, practically, physically, emotionally, mentally, there's still something missing. There's a spiritual core that we were made for, and suffering sort of brings the reality of that to the surface in our lives.
and would you say, and I think this was actually in your introduction, I don't want to misquote you, but that the homesickness is really for a person, not necessarily a place.
Yes. Yeah, I think we're all longing for home. We think about Adam and Eve in the garden, and they were created for perfection,
Yeah.
literal perfection. And we all came from the core of creation, God's creation story. And so we all have that longing. We all have that longing for perfection. And we see kind of it springing up as idealism,
Yeah.
as things are not ideal. And so there's a disappointment attached to that. There are unhealthy coping mechanisms attached to how do I get my own version of perfect here.
Mm,
But what we're not actually realizing is that all of our striving around that, even if we can create a perfect home, a perfect job, a perfect body, a perfect trajectory of a future, we still can't get back to the presence of God face to face right now.
right. Right.
And so that's what we long for. And that's what makes worship and prayer and communion with God and wonder and all those things, those conduits that bring us as close as they can on this side of Eden. That's why those are so important to our own spiritual formation, because they take us out of our longings and our strivings for kind of the substitutes that we create here, and they get us home to the real thing, to our permanent home. They position us face to face, metaphorically, if you will, spirit to spirit, with God in a place where we can commune with Him in our
I
permanent
love
home of His
that.
presence.
I love that. I love that. Thank you for unpacking that with me. Part of why I loved your book was I loved how you wove in your story, your family story of being immigrants in or serving the immigrant population of Texas, being in an underserved population, your dad's ministry, even his story. I won't give too much away of that, but just some really powerful things happening. So your stories in there, your faith journey, how you were impacted by these big things that happened in the church ministry. And then you were speaking about this idea of having a deeper connection with God, that you really I found that you really got to the heart of the relational aspect of the Trinity. So story and the Trinity are the two reasons why I just absolutely have loved this book, and I'm really enjoying the spiritual formation cohort. We're having just some some great discussions. Before we get too far into the book, I did want to ask, what inspired you? Like, what made you write this book, Befriending God?
I say this a lot in interviews, but it has to be said. For some people, making records is a dream, writing books is a dream. For others, it's a calling, and you get plucked out of obscurity, if you will, and you get asked to do something that you never thought you would do. And so I was leaving a tour at the time, and on that tour, there was about half of the time that was allotted for music, the other half was allotted for speaking. And as I would go to the merch table in the back, people would say, can I listen to you speak anywhere? Like, I'm buying your record, but can I listen to you speak anywhere? And so I was like, oh, so something began to stir in me around a resource, a tool to be able to give people as a conduit for them to experience the more that God offers in their life with God outside of music. And I left and was happy as a lark. That was an incredible tour. It was a dream tour. And God was like, hey, I might want you to write a book. Are you open to this? And in prayer, he just kind of spoke 3 words over me. He said, this is important. And
Wow.
so for the next 3 years, I embarked on a very unlikely, unexpected journey of really just trusting the Lord with the blank page before me and going, what do you want me to say? And so, as is true with records, when you start writing a record, you don't know what's going to come. You are a conduit, and it's almost like dictation for some of us. And that was also true here. I was like, what kind of a book do you want me to write? What do you want me to say? And very quickly, it was very clear that he was like, I want this to be about your friendship with me and how people can actually access a relationship with me that does not feel conceptual, but feels deeply personal. And that was a grand task.
Mm-hmm.
So I just had to set aside my entire life to really sit with him and go, what does this look like? Because we're speaking to a cultural norm, right? We're speaking to a rhythm of Christianity that has been set, the Sunday morning service, the
Yeah.
Wednesday night service, we're trying to actually ask people to imagine what life could be like with God if it went outside of their expected categorizations. And if they actually revisited the scriptures to understand what it looks like for it to be a real time process with God that does not look like categorization or compartmentalization is the word I'm looking for, but it looks more like a continual awareness of his presence
Mm,
all the time.
that's good. There's like so many different directions I could go right now. There's so many questions that are stirring. I'm going to actually read if it's okay, because I think you actually took me to a quote that I want to read. It's actually in chapter 3, Redeeming the Story. And I mentioned before, like your story. I think that you weave it in so well with God's bigger story of redemption and his love for his people. So on page 55 in chapter 3, you say that relationship is the goal. You are not a role to God, you are a beating heart. Those who have a transactional view of God place the template of transactional culture onto God who doesn't fit that mold. His love will not be boxed by titles and bottom lines, algorithms and likes, ones or zeros. He will turn one of those tables over in our hearts until we understand that his love is not for sale. And then later you say, he longs to love us just because he is love. And I think that just sums up so well this idea of relationship and God's desire to love us and God's desire to have relationship with us as well. Will you talk a little bit more about your story and your upbringing in this immigrant church community, and how did that influence your personal relationship with God and your awareness of his love for you?
My parents and I talk about this kind of on a steady basis, that growing up where we grew up and where they still are to this very day, you really have to depend on the supernatural in a
Mhm.
way that a lot of communities don't have to. I can't tell you how many times or how common it was for someone to get sick, for instance. No insurance, no money, no way to get the care that they needed. We would do what the New Testament says to do. We would have the elders of the church lay hands, anoint with oil, and
Oh,
so often, more times than I can count, we saw miracles.
mm,
But it was because we were positioned to have to ask for the impossible. I feel like in so many ways, the more you have, the less you ask for.
wow.
Like the more you have, the less you it's the more secure our systems of control are, the less that we are aware of the areas that we could use God's assistance in. We could use God's supernatural presence in, his divine intervention in, because
Wow.
we're just simply kind of coasting on our own sufficiency and our own, why ask if you already have? So that community positioned me for an awareness of God's supernatural qualities in a way that by the time that I left at 19, I had a whole host of like parted seas and manna from heaven, and I
Wow.
had a whole just slew of stories that I knew what God could do.
Mm,
But it was only because the amount of suffering that we had gone through had positioned us
wow.
to be able to encounter him and ask him for the impossible.
Mm, I love it. Well, you take me into another question that I wanted to ask. So in your book, you include stories both from your own life and from biblical figures. You talk about David and Joseph and Jesus and the narrow road. Um, in particular, I just am curious, even now, like if there is a person story, and even just now you mentioned like the manna from heaven and the parting of the Red Sea, and it might change like in different seasons, but is there a person in the Bible that really is just resonating with you in this season? Someone
Yeah.
else's story?
Yeah, there's always, I mean, I feel so close to all of them, but I feel really close to David. Um, I feel really close to his heart because he just wanted so badly on his best days to for his heart to be a resting place for God. And so his emotional honesty was a conduit for that. His worship was a conduit for that. And I love these days in this season to be operating from a place where I'm asking myself, is your heart aligned to God's heart like a David in the field?
Yeah.
Is your heart aligned to him like that? Are you comfortable with obscurity? Are you happy to be hidden?
Wow.
Are you pursuing his heart in the secret place through your gifts when no one is looking? Do you love him? Not for what he can do for you. Like, you're not a king, you're just a shepherd boy, and
Yeah.
it's enough.
Yeah.
And you're out there doing what God has asked you to do. Not because people are watching or there's this big victory that they know you for, but only because you hear his whisper and you respond. And the sweetness of that is just enough. And like, will you cultivate that with him? Will you make that your reward? I just think I've been living in that place for the last several years. And to me, it's one of the most anchoring places to ground yourself in prayer. Like, God, make me a David in the field.
Mm,
Make me a David of the field. I just want to have that purity and that be enough.
I
That's what
love
feels
that.
close to
I
me.
love that. I love David's story. I love how you connect with his story. You kind of touched on this through David, but in the book, you emphasize, I think it's in chapter 4, just the importance of emotional honesty with God. And that is something that I don't think it's touched on very much in our Western American Christian community. Um, why is that so important? And could you maybe share with listeners who maybe are not familiar with emotional honesty with God, how could they practice that even today?
I think somewhere along the lines of our culture, we've grown accustomed to, first of all, not praying at all. But if we do pray, if we get past our prayerlessness and we can get still enough, I see a lot of us really telling God what we think we want Him to know, either know about us or what we think He wants to hear. And I
Mm,
think Psalm 139 is a really good textbook kind of like study of the heart of David in that vein. So in that passage, we see him, I was fearfully and wonderfully created. It's this beautiful, like, sort of tribute to the loving divine nature of God that's very personal from in the inception of our lives. But then in a lot of Christian circles, we don't read what comes after that.
mm,
We stop when it gets to like away with he goes into this tangent of like being upset with his enemies and the wicked.
yeah,
And he really begins to show that he has an emotional response that involves discomfort, anger. It's not pleasant. And so we tend to operate in a lot of Christian cultures by just mentioning the things that we think are pleasant, easy, nice, righteous. And David kind of the Psalms, which David wrote many of those Psalms. David gives us kind of permission to
mm,
be human
yeah,
and to pray the unsanitized prayers that we think that nobody wants to hear. And you zoom out and you look at who he was as a person, and in the ocean of personalities in the Bible, he is a wild crashing wave.
yes,
His temperament swings very wide. And yet it is very clear that God does not tolerate David. Like, he actually loves David and he likes David. And
mm,
so, what that tells us is that we don't need to operate in prayer with the desire to be liked by God. God already loves us. Psalm 139 tells us that before we could earn it, that God already fearfully and wonderfully made us, loved us enough to do that. And so, what does it look like for us to show up with the things that we've never said to God before? Like,
mm,
the question that I would pose to anyone listening today would be, when was the last time that you sat down with God and you told him the whole truth, the unfiltered truth, not what you think that he wants to hear, but what is true? That is emotional honesty before God. And the thing is that he already knows it, right?
yeah,
But it's an act of trust. Do you trust God enough to actually tell him the whole truth? And if you
mm,
don't, what work needs to happen between you and him
yeah.
to heal that space in your heart?
I love that. And you talked about like David essentially is like giving us permission to be human and give that unfiltered prayer. I think it also models for us the importance of being honest about our struggles. And sometimes in that honesty with God about our struggles, that's where we have a need for God. So if we only come to God with like the sweet prayers and the bow tied on things after the resolve, after the provision, after whatever the thing might be, we miss that opportunity for the shaping and the forming to become formed like Jesus. Because it really, for me, in my journey, I would say that it's the struggle that often exposes my sin. It might expose a doubt or an area that I'm not trusting God. And often it exposes that need, like, God, I need you. And that's where we can experience intimacy, is that need for God. And he is so faithful. He shows himself Emmanuel, God with us. He's always with us and he meets us in those places. So I think emotional honesty, though it's maybe not often talked about and maybe not culturally the most popular thing, I think when we're talking about being formed like Jesus, it's essential. It's absolutely essential. So thank
Yes.
you for unpacking that with us. Friends, I had a feeling this was going to be a dynamic conversation. So I prepared our guests and said, hey, we might do 2 episodes. So we are going to wrap up this episode, but I am going to ask everyone, come back next week. We're going to have a part 2. I've got some great questions that I want us to unpack together. Friends, I'm going to go ahead and put the link to Tanya's book, Befriending God. So for those of you who are watching on YouTube, you can see this is what the book looks like. For those who are listening on other platforms, go to the show notes and I will have a link for you there. But come back next week for part 2 of this incredible conversation about befriending God. And until then, I'm Virginia Wear Kujabi, and this is The Formed Life.